The first time I ever heard my husband's voice shake was on a Wednesday morning in November, just as the first snow began to fall over our neighborhood in Ottawa. Gerald Sinclair stood in the hallway, gripping an envelope so tightly, it crumpled at the edges. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. When he finally spoke, his words came out fractured, barely recognizable. "They're auditing everything." For 31 years, Gerald had told anyone who would listen that I didn't understand finances. He said it at dinner parties. He said it to our children. He said it to neighbors, to colleagues, to strangers on golf courses. "Margot's wonderful," he'd say, "but numbers aren't really her thing." People always laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you did. You smiled through it. You let it pass. But standing in that hallway, watching Gerald's hands tremble over a government letter, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Calm. Because unlike Gerald, I wasn't surprised. I had been expecting this moment for nearly 8 months, and I knew exactly how much of his carefully constructed life was about to fall apart. If you've ever had someone you trusted rewrite who you are, I think you'll understand this story. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories with real-life lessons. And before we go on, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. My name is Margot Sinclair. I grew up in a small town outside Kingston, Ontario, the youngest of 3 daughters. My father ran a hardware store. My mother kept the books. Every evening after supper, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a calculator and a green ledger, entering figures in her careful handwriting. I used to watch her. She never rushed. She never guessed. Every cent had its place. When I was 17, she taught me how to reconcile a bank statement. "You don't need to love numbers," she told me. "You just need to respect them." I carried that lesson into adulthood. After college, I worked as an accounts clerk for a property management company in Kingston. The work was steady, unglamorous, and satisfying. I liked the precision of it. I liked that a balance sheet didn't care about your mood or your opinions. It simply told the truth. I met Gerald at a friend's wedding in 1991. He was 32, handsome in a restless sort of way, the kind of man who seemed to be moving towards something even when he was standing still. He'd recently started a small consulting firm that helped manufacturing companies streamline their operations. It was modest then. Just Gerald, a rented office, and an answering machine. We married 2 years later. The early years were good. Genuinely good. We talked about everything. We planned together. When our son Bryce was born in 1995, I took time away from work. When our daughter, Simone, arrived 3 years later, I stayed home permanently. It wasn't a sacrifice I resented. I wanted to be present. I wanted to pack the lunches and drive the carpool and sit through every school concert, even the terrible ones. Gerald's firm grew steadily during those years. 1 client became 5. 5 became 20. By the early 2000s, Sinclair Operations Group had offices in Ottawa and Toronto and employed nearly 40 people. Gerald became someone, not famous, but known, respected in certain circles, invited to the right events, quoted occasionally in trade publications. The more successful he became, the less he seemed to need me. Not as a wife exactly, but as a partner, as an equal. The shift happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it. Small comments first. Someone would ask about household budgets at a dinner party, and Gerald would wave his hand. "Oh, Margot lets me handle all that. She's more of a creative type." I wasn't a creative type. I had a diploma in accounting, but I smiled and let it go. Then the comments sharpened. One Thanksgiving, my sister asked about retirement planning. Before I could answer, Gerald cut in with a grin. "If Margot managed our retirement fund, we'd be retiring in a tent." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. That night I lay awake wondering why the joke burned the way it did. Because I knew he didn't mean it. At least that's what I told myself then. But the jokes kept coming. Year after year, dinner after dinner, until the story became the truth. Gerald understands money. Margot doesn't. Even our children absorbed it. Bryce grew up idolizing his father. He joined the firm straight out of university and never looked back. By 30, he spoke about business the way Gerald did. Confidently, as though understanding came from blood rather than effort. Whenever I offered a perspective on anything financial, Bryce would smile politely and redirect the conversation to his father. Simone was different, quieter, more observant. She moved to Vancouver after university and built a career in social work. She called every Sunday. She noticed things. She asked the kind of questions that made you realize she'd been paying attention all along. Around 2016, Gerald began pulling away from shared financial life entirely. Statements stopped arriving at the house. Tax documents disappeared into his office. When I asked questions, his answers became shorter. "It's all handled, Margot. Don't worry about it." That phrase became a wall. Every time I approached, it went up. Eventually, I stopped knocking, at least outwardly. Inside, something felt wrong. Not one dramatic thing. Just a persistent unease, like hearing a sound in your house at night that you can't quite identify. Gerald started traveling more. Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver. Business trips that appeared suddenly and required little explanation. When I suggested joining him once, he seemed almost startled. "It's all meetings," he said. "You'd be bored out of your mind." The excuse was reasonable. The delivery wasn't. It sounded rehearsed, like a line from a script he'd memorized long ago. One evening in the spring of 2023, I was organizing old files in our spare room when I found a box of documents I'd never seen before. Tax returns from previous years, insurance papers, corporate correspondence. Most of it looked routine, but several folders I expected to find were missing entirely. Not misplaced, gone. And for the first time, a thought entered my mind that I couldn't shake. What if Gerald wasn't hiding information because he thought I wouldn't understand it? What if he was hiding it because he knew I would? That question changed everything. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But it planted a seed that refused to stop growing. The discovery that broke my world open happened on a rainy Tuesday in June. Gerald had left early for a meeting. I was cleaning his home office. Something I rarely did anymore, since he'd made it clear over the years that everything inside was business, and business was apparently beyond my comprehension. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was dusting shelves and straightening papers when I noticed the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet seemed unusually shallow compared to the cabinet's depth. Years of bookkeeping had trained me to notice measurements that didn't add up. I pulled the drawer out completely. Beneath a false bottom secured by a small latch, I found a manila envelope stuffed with documents. My hands were trembling before I even opened it. The first pages were incorporation papers for something called Ridgeline Capital Partners. I had never heard that name. Gerald's firm operated under a completely different corporate structure. I kept reading. The company had been formed 18 months earlier. It held several financial accounts, property leases, and business agreements. Then I reached the signature pages, and my stomach dropped. My name was there. Margot Sinclair, listed as corporate officer and authorized signatory. My signature appeared on page after page. Or rather, something that resembled my signature appeared. Whoever had created them had studied my handwriting carefully. The strokes were close. The spacing was similar. But they weren't mine. After decades of signing documents, I knew my own hand. These were forgeries. Careful ones, but forgeries nonetheless. I kept reading because I had to. The next set of documents was worse. Loan guarantees, secured against business assets and, in one case, against retirement savings associated with my name. My retirement savings. The money I had accumulated over years. The funds that were supposed to protect me in old age. Someone had used them as collateral without my knowledge or consent. I sat at Gerald's desk for a very long time. The rain kept falling outside. The house was silent, and I realized this wasn't just about a husband keeping secrets. My identity had been used. My financial future had been placed at risk. And everything was wrapped in enough legitimate-looking paperwork to make it nearly invisible. I returned every document to the hidden compartment exactly as I'd found it. Then I drove to a cafe in the Glebe and sat by the window, ordering tea I didn't drink. My mind kept circling the same question. Who else was involved? That evening, I casually asked Gerald about his week. "Any interesting projects?" He talked for 20 minutes about a client in Calgary. Relaxed, confident, charming. The same Gerald everyone admired. Watching him perform felt like seeing a stranger wearing my husband's face. Over the following weeks, I searched for answers in every direction I could. Public business registries, corporate filings, any records I was legally entitled to access through my own name. One name kept appearing in the Ridgeline documents. Adrian Cote. I didn't recognize it, but it appeared on emails, authorizations, transfer records, meeting minutes. Whoever Adrienne Cote was, she occupied a central role in whatever Gerald had built. I found her eventually. Business consultant, 43 years old, based in Montreal. Polished LinkedIn profile, conference photos, charity events. And in several of those photos, standing very close to my husband. The kind of closeness that doesn't require explanation because the explanation is already obvious. She was elegant and confident and more than 20 years younger than Gerald. I stared at her photographs for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and stared at the wall instead. The betrayal felt different than I expected. Not explosive, just heavy. A deep, settling weight in my chest that wouldn't lift. I needed help. Real help. Not family, not friends. Someone who understood the legal and financial dimensions of what I was facing. That's when I thought of Thelma Okafor. We'd worked together briefly in Kingston decades ago, before life carried us in different directions. Thelma had become a financial attorney with a practice in Ottawa. We'd exchanged Christmas cards for years but hadn't spoken properly in ages. I called her on a Thursday morning. She answered on the second ring. When she heard the tension in my voice, she didn't waste time with small talk. Come see me this afternoon. 2 hours later, I sat in her office and laid everything out. The hidden company, the forged signatures, the retirement account guarantees. Adrienne Cote. Thelma listened without interrupting, reading each document carefully. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked at me with an expression I recognized from our younger days. Sharp. Concerned. Absolutely focused. Margot, she said quietly, this isn't just a marriage problem. If these documents are what they appear to be, someone has been using your identity in ways that could create serious legal and financial exposure. I already knew that. Hearing it from a lawyer made it real. How bad? I asked. She paused. Then she answered honestly. I don't know yet, but I think we need to find out. The next 2 months were the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I continued being Margot Sinclair. I cooked dinners. I attended a neighbor's retirement party. I smiled through Gerald's speeches at a charity event. Behind the scenes, I worked every evening after Gerald fell asleep. Documents, records, filings, transfer histories, everything I could legally access. Thelma guided me through the process, methodical and patient. The deeper we went, the more disturbing the picture became. Money had moved between entities in patterns that seemed deliberately complicated. Several companies appeared connected through overlapping officers and addresses, and through it all, 2 names appeared constantly. Gerald Sinclair and Adrienne Cote. One evening during this period, I received a call from Bryce. He wanted to discuss Christmas plans. The conversation was ordinary until I casually mentioned that Gerald seemed stressed lately. The silence on the other end lasted a beat too long. He's fine, Mom, just busy. The answer came too fast, too controlled. Something cold settled in my stomach. 2 weeks later, I asked Bryce to meet me for lunch. He looked tired. Dark circles beneath his eyes. We talked about nothing important for 10 minutes. Then I set down my fork. Bryce, I know about Ridgeline Capital. The color drained from his face. He didn't speak, didn't move. That reaction alone confirmed everything. How long have you known? I asked. He stared at the table. About 14 months. 14 months. More than a year of Sunday dinners and birthday calls and casual conversations, and my son had known the entire time. The pain of that was almost physical. He told me it was temporary, Bryce whispered. He said it was just a structure for tax efficiency. He said nobody would get hurt, and you believed him. Bryce closed his eyes. I wanted to. That was the most honest thing he'd said in over a year. He wanted to believe his father. Most children do. Even grown children. Especially when the alternative means accepting that their hero has been lying to everyone. Then I asked the question I'd been dreading. Did he give you anything? The shame on Bryce's face was answer enough. But I needed to hear it. 35,000, he said, barely audible. He called it a performance bonus. I drove home in silence. The Ottawa River glittered in the late afternoon sun, indifferent and beautiful. I thought about my mother at her kitchen table entering figures in her green ledger, respecting every cent. Telling the truth with numbers because people sometimes couldn't. That evening, Gerald came home in excellent spirits. He talked about a new contract. He poured wine. He told a joke about a colleague. I watched him from across the table and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping for a different explanation. Thelma called me a few days later. Her voice was unusually serious. Margot, if these financial patterns are what I think they are, the consequences could extend well beyond a divorce proceeding. What do you mean? I mean that banks and regulators tend to have strong opinions about this kind of activity, the kind that can freeze accounts. The word freeze settled into my mind and stayed there. Over the following weeks, the evidence continued to grow. Every new document, every traced transaction, every corporate filing added another piece to a picture I wished I couldn't see. Gerald hadn't just hidden money. He had created an entire parallel financial structure, built partly on my identity, secured partly against my retirement, and connected intimately to a woman I'd never been told about. One Sunday evening, during our usual family video call, Simone studied my face through the screen with that quiet intensity she'd inherited from my mother. After everyone else had hung up, she stayed on the line. "Mom, what's going on?" I hesitated. Then I told her. Not everything, but enough. The silence lasted several seconds. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Whatever you need, I'm there." The collapse began on that November Wednesday. The morning Gerald stood in our hallway with a crumpled envelope and a voice that shook. The Canada Revenue Agency had initiated a review of several entities connected to his name. Within 48 hours, banking institutions began their own inquiries. Accounts were restricted. Credit lines were suspended. Business operations ground to a halt. Gerald spent the next 3 days on the phone, pacing, shouting, negotiating, threatening. The transformation was remarkable. The composed businessman who had spent decades projecting control was suddenly a man drowning. Employees called with questions he couldn't answer. Partners called with concerns he couldn't address. Lenders called with demands he couldn't meet. On the third evening, he finally turned to me. He looked 10 years older. His tie hung loose. His eyes were bloodshot. "Margot, I need your help." The irony was breathtaking. 31 years of being told I didn't understand money, and now he needed me. I could have said many things in that moment. Instead, I simply asked, "What kind of help? I need to understand what's happening with the accounts." I looked at him steadily. "All of them? Or just the ones in my name?" The silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. Gerald's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, fear. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I stood and walked to the living room, where a folder sat waiting on the coffee table. I opened it and placed the first document on the table. Ridgeline Capital Partners. Incorporation papers. Gerald stared at it. I placed the next document beside it. Then the next. Loan agreements. Transfer authorizations. Forged signatures. Retirement account guarantees. One by one, the pages covered the table like a map of his deception. When I looked up, Gerald was standing perfectly still, pale as winter. "I know about the company," I said. "I know about the signatures. I know about my retirement savings. And I know about Adrian." That last word hit him like a physical blow. His carefully maintained separation between his two lives had just been destroyed in a single sentence. "You don't understand," he started. There it was. The phrase he'd hidden behind for 3 decades. "Then explain," I said. He couldn't, because there was no explanation that could make any of it acceptable. Gerald tried anyway. It was temporary. It was complicated. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. The excuses sounded hollow, thin, almost pathetic compared to the weight of evidence sitting between us. Then, he said something that revealed more than he intended. "If this gets out, it doesn't just affect me. It affects everyone. Everyone. Meaning there were others involved. Others at risk. Others connected to whatever he had built." "Gerald," I said quietly, "this is already out." He stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, sir. And perhaps he was. Because the woman standing in front of him wasn't the person he'd spent decades describing to the world. She never had been. The months that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because I doubted myself. That chapter was finished. The difficulty was watching consequences spread through people I loved. Bryce suffered enormously. The guilt that had been eating him for over a year became impossible to conceal. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. During a formal interview, he was asked direct questions about what he knew and when he knew it. For the first time in his life, he chose honesty over loyalty to his father. The decision visibly broke him. Afterward, he called me. "I told the truth, Mom. I closed my eyes. I know. A long pause. Then, I should have told you from the beginning. Yes, you should have. More silence. Then, I'm sorry. The apology was genuine. That made it both easier and harder to hear. Because if Bryce had been deliberately cruel, forgiveness would have been simpler. But he hadn't been cruel. He'd been weak. And weakness, I was learning, can cause damage just as devastating as malice. Simone flew in from Vancouver twice during the worst of it. She organized documents. She sat with me during meetings. She held my hand in waiting rooms without saying a word. One evening, over tea at my kitchen table, she said something that stayed with me. You spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. It's okay to take care of yourself now. I had never thought of self-protection as something I deserved. I was learning. Gerald's world contracted steadily. Adrian Cote disappeared from his life the moment financial difficulties became public. Relationships built on money rarely survive its absence. Business associates who once competed for Gerald's attention quietly distanced themselves. The firm shrank. The invitations stopped. The reputation he'd spent decades building eroded in months. I watched it happen with a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. Because despite everything, Gerald had once been the man I loved. Watching someone fall is painful even when they've earned it. The house was the hardest part. Our home in Rockcliffe Park, where we'd raised 2 children, hosted countless dinners, celebrated birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday evenings. Every room held memories. But every room also held lies. I couldn't separate the two any longer. In the spring, I made the decision to leave. Not Ottawa. Just the house. Just the version of my life that had been built on someone else's terms. Both children were initially shocked. Then, slowly, they understood. Bryce helped me pack. It was the first truly selfless thing he'd done in years. Carrying boxes, assembling furniture, driving back and forth across the city without complaint. I think he needed to do it. I think the physical work gave him something guilt alone couldn't provide. A way to rebuild. One box at a time. My new home is a modest townhouse near Dow's Lake. Nothing extravagant. A small garden out back. A reading chair by the front window where I can watch the canal in the mornings. It's quiet. Not the tense quiet that filled my marriage, but the peaceful kind. The healing kind. The first morning after I moved in, I made coffee and sat by the window. Snow was falling softly over the canal. A woman jogged past with her dog. A man cleared his driveway. Ordinary life, continuing the way it always does. I thought about my mother, about her green ledger, and her careful handwriting, and the lesson she taught me at 17. You don't need to love numbers, you just need to respect them. She was right. But I think the lesson was bigger than numbers. It was about truth, about paying attention, about never letting someone else's voice come louder than your own. 6 months after moving, I started volunteering at a community center near my neighborhood. A weekly workshop for women, mostly over 50, who wanted to understand their finances better. The first session attracted 4 women. By autumn, more than 25 came regularly. Some brought notebooks. Some brought questions they'd been afraid to ask for decades. One woman, nearly 80, told me she'd never once looked at her own bank statement. Her husband had always handled it. He'd died 2 years earlier, and she still didn't know where the money went. I think of her often. I think of all of them. Women who spent lifetimes being told they didn't need to understand these things. Women who believed it because the people telling them were people they loved. A few months ago, a letter arrived. Handwritten. Gerald's return address. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was something I never expected. Not excuses. Not justifications. Just an acknowledgement. He wrote about the choices he'd made and the damage they caused. He wrote about the years he'd spent diminishing me. Not because he believed I was incapable, but because my capability frightened him. A wife who understood numbers was a wife who might ask questions. And questions were dangerous to a man with secrets. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, just stored. A chapter that belonged to the past. People sometimes ask me what the greatest victory was. Was it protecting my finances? Exposing the truth? Watching Gerald face consequences? The answer always surprises them. The greatest victory was remembering who I was before the lies, before the diminishing, before the decades of making myself smaller so someone else could feel larger. I remembered that I was intelligent, capable, resilient. worth listening to, worth protecting. And once I remembered those things, nothing Gerald had done could define me anymore. Because the most valuable account I recovered wasn't held in any bank. It was my confidence. And unlike the accounts Gerald lost, nobody can ever freeze that. Sometimes the most dangerous lie isn't the one someone tells about money. It's the one they tell about you. For years, I let another person's words become my truth. I let his description of me replace my own. I trusted so completely that I forgot to stay curious. What I learned is that trust and awareness are not opposites. You can love someone deeply and still ask questions. You can support someone fully and still protect yourself. You can be generous without being blind. No matter your age, no matter how long you've been told otherwise, it is never too late to understand your own finances, to protect your own future, to reclaim your own voice. Your value doesn't depend on whether someone else recognizes it. You are capable even when others doubt you. You are strong, even when life tries to convince you otherwise. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you trusted? What would you have done in my situation? Leave a comment below and share your experience. Your story might give strength to someone who needs it today. And if you enjoy heartfelt family stories with real-life lessons, please subscribe and join our community. Thank you for spending this time with me.